right, welcome. Welcome everyone to this conversation we've been really looking forward to. One thing that this the virtual format of this year's meetings has given us is the opportunity to engage people who might not have been coming to the meetings for, and as we saw with John Roberts, for example, he came, the fellows, and I have to start over. Here's what I want to say. I want to thank the AFS Oral History Society. No, it's not the Oral History Project, and the Folklore Fellows for co-sponsoring this session, as they co-sponsored the session yesterday with John Roberts. And as with John Roberts, we saw this as a great opportunity to bring in some voices that we haven't heard from lately in the last few years at AFS, including, as you saw yesterday, John Roberts, and today, Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett. You're already by now probably very familiar with the format. You'll be entering any questions and comments and affirmations and ideas and so forth in the chat box. Okay, so we know that.
Excuse me, Mary, I cannot use chat. I'm a blind person, and as you know, and chat doesn't work with my Braille display. So if I do have a question, could I raise my hand?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
That's great. That would be great. We'll be watching for that, Margaret.
And for everybody else too. Anybody who needs to do that.
Anybody who needs to do that, please do. Okay, now Barbara has had, there are a number of online versions of interviews with Barbara that are available, and I'll be putting links to those in the chat room. And Amy will allude to them in the introduction that she's about to give. And also, one of the highlights of yesterday, there were many highlights, but the highlights of John Roberts' conversation was the banana pudding recipe of his mother's that he shared. And we have a recipe to share with you from Barbara as well. And you can look for that in the chat room. So without much more ado, we're up to 60 people. I'm going to turn this over to Amy to introduce Barbara. And then we'll begin our conversation. We're anticipating that this conversation may definitely develop a life of its own. And we're going to encourage all of you to enter your questions. And if you have ideas of stories you'd like to share about Barbara or your time with her or anything like that, we highly encourage that. And the chat, the wonderful thing about the chat function is that it's a fabulous souvenir that we don't get during our actual meetings. So I'd like to turn this over to Amy Shuman. And
welcome everyone. We're just so thrilled to have this opportunity. Mary Hufford and I met Barbara in the fall of 1975, our first year in graduate school. She had been at Penn for a few years by then, and previously she had taught at the University of Texas, Austin, and she also studied folklore with Alan Dundes at Berkeley and got her PhD at Indiana University. So she has studied at many of the important centers for folklore scholarship in North America, and she's also lectured all over the world and had a presence elsewhere as well. She's the author of many books and countless articles. And we thought that rather than recite them here, why don't you all post your favorite Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett article, title, or book on the chat. So you're familiar with some of them. And I wonder, those of you from the University of Pennsylvania will recognize this as a Don Yoder moment, who always showed us books. So this is, instead of PowerPoint, I decided to do that. This is her book, Number Our Days, and her book that most of you know, Destination Culture. I'm only going to do 3, don't worry, I'm not going to do them all. And They Call Me Mayer July, her book about her father's paintings. So some of you have a favorite article. By the way, A Parable in Context was her very first AFS presentation. Hard to live up to something like that. in the past couple of years, she has told her academic life story, and it's illustrated. The Indiana Dorson lecture that we've posted is her account, and we couldn't do any better than that here. So please be sure to take a look at both of those on the chat. The Indiana lecture starts from her life in the immigrant Jewish neighborhood in Toronto, where she grew up, and takes us through her journey to the POLIN Museum in Warsaw, where she has been working for the past decade or so. And as she says in the interview, she ended up where she started. There are amazing stories in these interviews. One of my favorites is she talks about her first meeting with Alan Dundes, and she says that his study was as if the Red Cross had just evacuated. So you'll hear other great stories. So we want to build on those conversations and invite Barbara to elaborate on some of the moments and patterns, and to share with us her sense of what the present moment can mean for the future of folklore. And so, Barbara, turning to you, you've laid the foundational struts, and some of these mark significant turning points, both in your life and career and in the field. They're turning points against an unfolding world historical backdrop. And the other thing that's evident from the interviews is that you really had to create your pathway in folklore by yourself. It's not that you didn't have exceptional teachers, but you had to invent yourself and the field that we came to know. In contrast, Mary and I and some of the others here benefited from that reinvention. We walked into a field that was made by you and others. So we wanted to start by asking you if you'd talk a little bit about what we call the magical years at Penn.
Okay. Well, thank you very, very, first of all, I want to thank Mary and Amy for this opportunity, which I have been away from AFS during the whole period that I've been in Poland working on POLIN Museum. So this format has allowed me to come back to AFS, and we don't know what going forward AFS meetings will look like, but I do hope to be able to participate in them again, because I began right from graduate school. I'm a lifetime member, and I don't think I missed but one meeting during the period when I was able to attend. So, and I want to thank the fellows as well. So now the magical years at Penn. Well, but let me just say that that my path to Penn was marked both by fierce defenders of the field and the I would call them the empire builders, each in their own way. I would say Alan Dundes as a one-man show, and Richard Dorson as really an institution builder. But I was also spurred by Bertrand Bronson, who refused to write me a letter of recommendation to enter the PhD program in folklore at Indiana University. You know, those are the two poles of my experience at Berkeley, which is where I first encountered folklore with Alan Dundes. So here Alan Dundes is doing everything possible to encourage me to go forward in the field. And here's Bertrand Bronson telling me that I was committing professional suicide, and who said he would not write me a letter of recommendation, even though I got an A in his 2 graduate seminars on the English and Scottish popular ballad. And he said, look at me, I'm an 18th century, English literature historian, and why can't you get a degree in a real field? And then you can always do folklore. So that I think is, I think about that a lot, because in a way, I think his refusal and setting yourself up as a model was even, I thought to myself, all the more do I really want to pursue this? And so I got to Penn having actually studied or taught at every single major folklore program: Berkeley, Indiana, Texas, Penn. And when I got to Penn, I had been introduced in a way to what Penn would become by Kenny Goldstein, who came to IU in the summers. And when he came to IU, he came bearing gifts. He came bearing the gifts from Penn. And what were the gifts? Something new was happening. And it was really different from what we were getting at IU. I mean, what we're getting at IU was, it would be a kind of an updating of the motif index, the tail type index. Now there was something called context. And it was classic. It was finished geographic method. It was, periodically we would meet Stith Thompson, who was by that time very old and very stiff and very tall. And it was kind of like, Mount Olympus. And we would meet Stith Thompson, but that, and Warren Roberts and material culture. And it was classic. I would say that it was Dorson classic. But in the summer, when Kenny brought I would say that the new developments from Penn, that was something else altogether. And what was it? It was essentially ethnography of communication, sociolinguistics. It was basically, it was an approach that was so much more than what we were calling context, so much more than context. So that was my introduction to Penn. And of course, I had no idea that a few years later that I would actually be able to join the Penn faculty. And when I joined it, it was by far the golden age, no question about it. It was Del Himes and John Schwed and Henry Glassy and Ray Birdwhistle and Irving Goffman. And I'm trying to think, and of course, Kenny Goldstein and Don Yoder. And it was just, it was really, in a way, I think I envied the students, because I wished I could have been studying there at the time that I was teaching there. Students would come back from having, had classes with Birdwhistle, or having had classes with Goffman, or, with Schwed, with Glassy. I thought to myself, what would I give to be there in the room with them as a student? So it was, so that's one piece of it. The second piece of it is wonderful students, you included. Really, it was a golden generation of students, and that combination of those students, that faculty, and the intellectual moment when, and of course, a bill above, it was an intellectual moment where it wasn't, let me put it this way, although Kenny was an empire builder and he did create a vibrant, very strong field called, a department of folklore and folk life. What was brilliant about it is that it became a haven for people who were not trained in folklore, but were not happy where they found themselves. Maybe they were in anthropology, maybe they were in, wherever they were on the campus, but they didn't actually feel that those places where they would technically fit were actually hospitable. And so they came to folklore. I mean, who would even think that way? You would think that maybe the folklorists would think these other fields are a higher prestige and move out to those other fields. But no, and of course, Roger Abrams was there at the same time. I mean, can you imagine all those people at Penn at more or less the same time? And the idea that folklore was not only a safe haven, but it was a place where these strands that were coming from different disciplinary formations would be able to really weave a wonderful fabric. Call it folklore, I don't care what you call it. Intellectually, it was a very unique, very, very special moment. And I certainly benefited as a faculty member, but honestly, I wish I had been a student.
Well, it really was fabulous to be a student then. And studying with you was amazing because, as I said, you had to invent yourself, but we had the benefit of your having put together what you thought we needed. And we want to move in this interview with you toward asking what that would look like next. What are the things that academic folklore can bring to all the practices that all of us do, that, given if we have the opportunity to shape the field in that way. So after Penn, you moved to NYU, where you really continued to influence the field of folklore, in part bringing these ideas that you had generated at Penn to NYU, but also having new opportunities there, especially New York City. So we wanted to ask you to speak about that.
Well, basically, Max, is my husband. He felt for some time that the best place to be, particularly for him as an artist, was New York. My approach was that I wanted to be wherever it was, from my point of view, wherever it would be best professionally in terms of being a folklorist. So what that meant was, after Indiana, the first opportunity was to join the faculty, thanks to Dick Bauman and to Roger Abrams, to join the faculty at Texas. So we had gone to San Francisco for Max. Then he came with me to Bloomington so that I could do the PhD in folklore at IU. And then he thought we're going to go to New York. But no, I got my first faculty position at Texas. So then the question was, well, how do we get to New York from Texas? And basically it was through an NEH and an NEA grant for the Yiddish Folk Song Project at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. But once in New York, that was for 2 years. How do we stay there? And it was great good fortune that the position at Penn opened up. And then through also great good fortune, about 7 or 8 years later, I was offered to chair the department of, at that time, graduate drama at NYU. So when I got a phone call from Richard Schechner, and Richard is very unusual, very special, very dear friend, but he's very direct. I pick up the phone. Hello. He said, hello, this is Richard Schechner. How would you like to chair our department? So I thought, wow, no, how are you? No, what's the weather? Just, how would you like to chair our department, a graduate department of drama? I said, I'm not interested, number one, in chairing a department, and I'm not interested in chairing a department of drama, of all things. He said, well, how about lunch? I said, sure. So basically, I met with Richard and 3 colleagues, at that time a very small department. And what I discovered was that they had some very big ideas. They wanted to transform this graduate department of drama into a department of performance studies. So I said, but why would you want a folklorist? They knew my work, and I had been in touch with them around city lore projects and things of that kind. But I said, why a folklorist? They said, because we want to really make it a department of performance studies. And if we hire somebody who's a theater historian, it'll be, we're worried about sliding back into theater. We want to make sure there's no way back. So I thought, well, okay, but I was like a Trojan horse, because I actually, in my heart of hearts, what I really wanted to do was to establish a folklore program at NYU. And I thought, if there's no other way to get there than to agree to chair this department and make it into a department of performance studies, maybe I could create a folklore program somehow. So I can remember sitting in the dean's office, wonderful, this is David Oppenheim, who passed away a few years ago. I remember sitting there, and he's talking to me about performance studies, and I'm talking to him about a folklore program. And he was a very wise and very patient guy. And, gradually became clear to me that there was no prospect at all for there to be a folklore program, no matter how many courses I put together, no matter what kind of a case I made. So I basically reconciled myself that it was going to be performance studies. And I figured, give it about 2 years and they'll figure out they hired the wrong person. But by that time, it'll be too late. So I developed my first course. It was called The Aesthetics of Everyday Life. I didn't want to call it Folklore 101 or something of or Introduction to Folklore. That would have been dead on arrival. So I called it The Aesthetics of Everyday Life. And the first thing is that nobody understood what it was, and I had to defend it to the curriculum committee. They just did not have a clue. The second was I was convinced that nobody would sign up for it, and that would be the moment where the department would realize they had made the fatal mistake. Well, as it turned out, it was full to overflowing. And who was there? Choreographers and dancers and actors and directors and playwrights and all kinds of people who are really from, bona fide from theater and dance. And they said, we know all about theater. We've had enough theater history up to here. But this is interesting for us. And of course, if you know anything about postmodern dance, postmodern theater, postmodern performance, of course, this is where they live. And so in a way, I found my footing after I, who was the most skeptical of all, had successfully defended the course. And what happened was that basically I would say that I found myself in a very, very interesting situation, which is to say that I didn't have to defend myself as a folklorist. I didn't have to defend folklore as a field. What I could do was to bring that performance oriented approach to the aesthetics of everyday life to a broad spectrum performance studies field in the making. So what did it mean? It meant that, to go one by one. So Richard Schechner, in a way, his awakening had two moments. One moment was off Broadway experimental theater, and quite radical. Naked, Dionysus. It was experimental theater off Broadway. The second moment for him was the Ramlila in India. And so non-Western, basically, in his case, it was specifically Ramlila. These were two defining moments for him. Brooks McNamara, for him, the defining moments were vaudeville, American popular entertainment. For Michael Kirby, it was the historical avant-garde, and them taking inspiration from everyday life and from construction sites and cranes and from circus and from all kinds of essentially non-professional theatrical performance forms. So each of them had somehow or other found something of contemporary intellectual, theoretical, and aesthetic interest somewhere other than on the stage or in conventional theater. Well, then I realized, I fit in perfectly because in a way I'm at the, I don't mean to create a hierarchy, but in a way I'm at the lowest end of that spectrum. I don't do Ramlila, but I do conversation and the aesthetics of everyday life. One of my favorite units in that course was a unit on laundry, on a clothesline, showing this wonderful film called Clothesline, which was just the aesthetics of a clothesline of people hanging laundry and women talking about it. Because I was thinking to myself, what's the least theatrical thing I can, in terms of performance, what's the least obvious? I don't know, sleeping? I don't know where to go for something that would seem to defy any kind of what you might call giving form to meaning, giving value to form. Where do you go for that? Where there is absolutely nothing. Well, I don't even have to go spectacular. Nothing that you would call, quote, a performance. Performing the laundry. No, it doesn't even go there. But the idea that there can be so much, if you will, meaning and value attributed to such modest, humble, quotidian acts, that for me was extremely interesting. And it turns out it was extremely interesting for the students that we had as well. So I think that I benefited enormously from the what Richard calls a broad spectrum approach. What that meant was this. The first thing they wanted to do was to deal with modes of performance that were not, Oedipus to Eugene O'Neill. So that's what they have been teaching. They have been teaching drama. They wanted to they wanted to get away from Europe, from Western performance, from the stage, from theater history as we normally know it. And so they wanted a broad spectrum. What that meant was it had to be more than Europe. So it meant, of course, Asia, India, etc. The second was that it needed to be I would say not multi-genre, but it needed to be, it should include music, dance, speech, the whole range. And that theoretically it should be multidisciplinary. So it shouldn't be so literary, not so much dramatic literature, not so much theater history, that it should really be multidisciplinary in every regard, and it should be theoretically rich. So theoretically rich meant that, of course, critical race theory, gender, drawing also from Barbara Meyerhoff and from people working in Victor Turner, ritual, anthropology, ethnography, and I would say maybe less so now, but certainly when I came to the department, that it should be empirically rich. So there was a very strong ethnographic I would say, aspect to it, but just the idea, and particularly Richard and myself, but I think Brooks also, Michael too, I think that for all of us, the idea of the grounding our work, that it should be theoretically interesting, theoretically generative, but that it should also be empirically grounded. And the idea, and this I think was absolutely critically important, of generating theory from practice. This is from art. In their case, it would be from artistic practice. That it was very often that it wasn't that the theory came first and the practice followed, but that it was in the practice that there was a kind of discovery of new theoretical possibilities. And that's what also why this kind of empirically grounded approach was so important. So in my teaching, and I think for Richard also, and TDR, the journal that Richard's been editing for decades, there was this feeling that the idea of, in a sense, working theoretical ideas through an empirical engagement, whether the theories were already well formulated or whether they were emerging from this empirical work, that for me was very, very appealing, pardon me, and it informed my teaching, excuse me, and it informed my work. So it was multidisciplinary, it was multicultural, it was multi-genre, if you will, and it was an extremely open. And I got to teach courses. I'm thinking to myself, would these be courses that I would teach at Penn? I mean, for example, first of all, it was a graduate program, and that was a great luxury because, mind you, I love teaching undergraduates too. I mean, that's really the freshness of teaching undergraduates is a great joy. But teaching graduate students and creating a whole new, whole new cohorts and whole new generations of scholars is a very special privilege. So, for example, so I did aesthetics of everyday life, tourist productions, museum theater, food and performance, of course, research methods, issues and methods in performance studies. I'm trying to think of, a Jewish performance. So those were the courses, but they're quite different from what different and similar to what I taught at Penn. And of course, aesthetics of everyday life. At Penn, for example, and with Mary, we really pioneered folklore and aging. I think that was a whole area, and exactly the grand generation, marvelous. And Margie, I see that Margie is here. Grand generation. Oh my God, was that a fabulous project?
Barbara, we always we put in there, if books could have grandmothers, Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett would be the grandmother of this project.
It was a
great project, really fabulous project. So, but so it was no question that the experience of a folklorist by training in a performance studies world was really, I think, very, very productive. I think certainly productive for me intellectually, but also I think it was productive for the field as well. And it's not something I would ever have been able to predict.
So Barbara, one thing that you've really modeled in your career, I think, is this, what you were just touching on, theory arising out of practice, the sui generis approach to life, career, everything. I mean, as somebody has noted in the chat. So you have really straddled in a lot of ways that pesky, pernicious, continuing public sector academic divide, which you pretty rigorously dispatched with your article on mistaken dichotomies, but which nonetheless persists.
I can't believe it. It still persists.
Well, we have.
Well, look at Ben Amos as a case in point, as sort of an extreme case in point. But anyway.
Well, he persists. But no. But there are people who still experience it. This has come up as a theme during the meeting. And it has been actually linked in some of our conversations over the past several days to the problem of systemic racism in the society. And I don't know if there's anything. So the thing is, Barbara, you seem to have modeled an approach to integrating the academic and the public sector sort of work. In other words, you haven't seen it as, you know, the division of labor as the academy studies and thinks about public sector and then theorizes from that. It's been more like you've been out there thinking with everybody about what's going on.
Oh, wow. Thank you. I would say this. Well, I was thinking, because I know this was discussed earlier in the meetings this year, and that is that I think in many ways the public sector has been better positioned to address, well, addressing systemic racism is maybe going too far, but I don't know that the American Folklore Society has done a kind of audit on itself, which I think would be worthwhile. And I don't know that it's done an audit on the field, looking, for example, at the academy, just to see what actually is going on and what have been the impediments to a more inclusive field. And I would say those are I would start with those. There are three arenas. I mean, one arena would be the society itself, and that would include the journal, the fellows, the membership, the executive board. You know, I think it's worth an audit. I think that would be worthwhile. The second, of course, would be within the academy, where folklore is not alone. Obviously, it's part of a more general, I would say, set of issues. And then within the public sector. And within the public sector, somehow I have the feeling that it is a more open and more inclusive arena, both in terms of the communities that are basically benefiting from the activities of public folklorists, probably, and for the opportunities of members of those communities to play a significant role in public sector folklore. I may be wrong, but that is the feeling that I have, that there seems that maybe it has to do with awareness and initiatives, activism on the part of state arts councils. I don't, I mean, this is just intuitive, but I think that we might learn something from the public sector in terms of inclusiveness, and I mean it at all levels. Communities that are benefiting from public folklore, the public folklorists themselves, community activists. I think it would be worth looking at. So that would be initially not so much an assessment, but as a call for taking this topic seriously and doing a kind of audit. And then on the basis of that audit, asking what steps can we take to make this field more representative and more inclusive. So that would be on that front. In terms of this divide, you know, it's absolutely fascinating for me because, well, you know, I love Dan Benamos, and I have known Dan since I came to Folklore, Indiana in 1967. So we go back a long way. And probably, I think Elliot Oring might be also, he's one of my favorite sparring partners, also from hours arguing with him in the Kiva at IU. But I think, so Dan is probably not completely alone. You know, it's, well, for me, let me put it this way. What I love about Dan is that he is really holding the fort. He will continue to teach folklore at Penn no matter what. He's the last one. He's the last of them. Well, I don't want to, that's not proper formulation, but in any event, he's the last man standing when it comes to folklore. He has put, you know, a stake in the ground, and he says, I am not moving. You know, I will stay here for as long as I can stand upright. So in that way, I think that I really admire, I mean, I must say, I really admire that. And I can, in a sense, forgive him for upholding this divide between public and academic folklore. At least he's really true to his principles. That said, I just think it does public folklore a terrible, terrible disservice, and that it really ignores the important intellectual contributions that public folklore has made to the field. And therefore, for me, at an intellectual level, there's no distinction. At a practical level, there is, and that's important. Practically speaking, we are working in different arenas, but intellectually, there is no value there is absolutely no value to somehow or other separating how, how we think if we're public folklorists and how we think if we're academic folklorists. That doesn't take us anywhere. On the contrary, and not only that, I'm not saying that this is a model for everybody, but somebody that I greatly admire for maintaining, I would say, a very creative intellectual life as a folklorist while being extremely effective in the public sector is Robert Barron. He was running the folk arts section or the folk arts, whatever, some big division of the New York State Council on the Arts for decades. And at the same time was intellectually active, publishing, being a very important voice in the intangible heritage arena, attending international conferences, serving on major international committees, and really, I would say, really leveraging his academic training with a PhD in folklore, plus all of his experience at the State Arts Council with all of his knowledge of all the programs that he was responsible for supporting. I mean, I'm not saying everybody can go that route, but my feeling is that we lose when we A, maintain the division, and B, maintain the hierarchy.
Barbara, that's wonderfully clarifying, especially your point about that intellectually we occupy common ground, even though we're operating out of different sectors. So we have a number of questions that we want to ask you. I wanted to call attention to a question that we have in the chat here from Sally Anna Steiner. We'd really like to hear about what it was like being a folklorist in Poland. How is the field perceived there, and what kinds of opportunities or challenges do you see for folklore in Poland or in Central Eastern Europe more generally? And we will come to a point where people just can ask their own questions. I wanted to make sure that doesn't fall between the cracks. Bookmark that. Amy, did you have something that you wanted to?
Well, you could probably answer this at the same time. Also in the chat, there's been a lot of commentary, you should know, Barbara, with people saying the divide doesn't exist anymore. So there we go. However, we do face this divide that you've alluded to about inclusivity. And so one question would be what it is that the Academy could do to better prepare students for a more inclusive folklore. And maybe that's connected to answering the question about your work in Poland.
Okay, just a second. So in terms of my work in Poland, I don't think there's any folklore program as such, but there is ethnography, I would say, and there are ethnographic museums that folklorists would really totally understand as being a place where they see folk art, folk culture. So the two areas I would say would be ethnography / anthropology understood in the American sense of anthropology, and ethnographic museums. And I'm only really in touch with one person, Eva Klekot, who's a very dear friend and a wonderful scholar, who has really looked at folkloristics, and especially the state, if you will, state intervention in folk art production in the communist period. Very, very, really, really interesting. So I'm not in a great position to comment on the study of folklore in Poland as an academic field. I'm more aware of what's going on in ethnographic museums. That would be my first point. The second, and pardon me, is maybe not quite an answer to that question, but would be something that we could talk about, which is what is it like to be a folklorist in a history museum, and specifically in POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews, because that, I think that was also a very, very unlikely choice. I mean, why did they not choose a historian, which would be the logical thing to do? I mean, the logical thing would have been to pick an historian with a PhD in history from Warsaw University, with a whole team of more historians, also with PhDs from Warsaw University. That would have been the logical thing to do. but that's not what they did. And I think that initially, I mean, just to give you a sense of, initially when I was first hired, and this would have been in 2006, I was a consultant since 2002, but in 2006, I remember that people in Poland were eager for me to meet with one of the biggest donors to the museum in New York. So I remember, I can see it as if it were yesterday, sitting at a little table in a dark, area of a I don't know, restaurant, cafe, bar or something, in the middle of the day, nobody was there. And then the guy looked at me and he said to me, "A folklorist? An anthropologist?" He said. "What kind of an exhibition are we going to get? Is it going to be teepees and feathers?" And I thought, teepees and feathers? And then the next terrible thing it could be would be shtetl, and I just, my heart sank. I just thought to myself, boy, this is going to be a mountain to climb. I not only do I have to get over every other hurdle, I also have to get over every stereotype about what a person with my training would bring to a project like this. So that's something else that we can discuss. So, but going to Amy, to the question that you posed about what we can do about inclusivity. Well, I don't have an answer, because I think that it's a more general question for the academy as a whole, honestly. I mean, I think, of course, it's a question for the public sector, but I actually think it's a more critical. I think that the opening to the academy is a much narrower opening, and I think that the hurdles that the academy presents are more daunting than the public sector. I think the public sector is simply more accessible, generally, maybe not as sustainable, and maybe not as prestigious, but it is definitely more accessible. And so the issues, gosh, they're issues for the academy more generally. I can't go beyond that.
Yeah, let me continue sort of in that thread though, because the 1960s triggered the paradigm shift in folklore. So it was really the politics of the time that you were very much part of, and we're experiencing another paradigm shift in the present. I mean, actually, at my university, I see the opening not in the old venues of literature or places like that, but in things like cultural sustainability, at the intersections that people like Mary actually are creating with forestry and land use and environment, where I do think that folklore might be able to engage without the pushback that that you would find today. You're right, the academy is narrowing at this very moment. But I wonder if you think that in this current time of turbulence, this really unprecedented new time of turbulence, if you might comment on what the skills and sensibilities of the folklorist might contribute.
Yeah, well, that's something I've been thinking about as well. And I think that as we were discussing in preparation for today, I think of folklorists as warriors of civil society. And I think of our work, and this, I think also maybe in part, it's not really an answer to the question of inclusivity, but I do think that it is an aspect of our work in the academy and in the public sector, especially in the public sector. And I think of it especially in the context of museums, is because that's been where I have really been living for so much of my career. And that is that in this era, the strengthening of civil society is my top priority. It is what I consider to be of the utmost importance. Now, I see it in a couple of regards. The value for me of having spent the last 15 years or so in Poland is that I have a perspective of what civil society looks like in a young democracy, and what it looks like in post-communist Eastern Europe, and what it looks like under a center-right ruling party, and what it looks like under a right-wing ruling party. So I have I have that perspective, and I never thought I'd live to see the day of what we've lived through the last 4 years. I don't think anybody in their wildest imagination could have imagined what we have been experiencing in the last 4 years. And so I think that like like the 60s, the women's movement, the civil rights movement, the free speech movement, the anti-war movement, all of those movements, and they were a kind of perfect storm. They're all coming at the same time. And then today, with Black Lives Matter and with the climate activists, there's a whole and issues around police brutality and injustice and systemic racism and income inequality. There's just it's again, but also, if I understand, I mean, if it's true that we are witnessing the largest social movement in the history of America, that is something. And when you look to see what it consists of the age range, and especially this younger cohort, and and that it is across the spectrum. It's not just simply if you will, a Black movement or a minority movement, but it's across the spectrum. I think we really are living in an historic and a transformative moment. And what that means is, and I see it to a lesser degree in Poland because it's a more repressive, authoritarian situation. But what it is it's the power of civil society to bring about peace, to use peaceful means to bring about radical change. And that, I think, and we're seeing it trying to happen in Belarus, although we don't know yet what the outcome will be. And now we're also seeing things happening in Thailand. So if you look internationally, and we don't know whether these are protest movements of the moment or whether they will actually lead to systemic changes, but I do believe they will. And I think there is a feeling that there will be systemic changes, maybe not as radical or as quickly as we would like, but there will be. So what does it mean to strengthen the resilience of civil society, and what is the role of folklorists in bringing that about? What I would say is that that the work of folklorists, let's start with the public sector, the work of folklorists in, if you will, working with local communities at the grassroots, in a way discovers I would say, a certain sort of social, political, and cultural competencies that might otherwise be overlooked, that are already there, that are already there, and that can be strengthened and leveraged and affirmed and empowered. And I think that folklorists are extremely, and especially public folklorists, are especially well positioned to work with local communities in that regard, and to, in a sense, look for opportunities to amplify their voices and amplify their impact. So not only their impact in improving the conditions of their own lives and their own neighborhoods, but also being part of wider and larger movements. And whether that translates into voting or political mobilization or get out the vote, in whatever form that it takes. So I think that would be on that piece of it. When I think about it in relation to people who are working in, for example, museums, in my case, it is an opportunity to, in a sense, strengthen what I think of as 21st century competencies like media literacy, competencies like emotional intelligence, competencies like critical thinking, competencies like informed civil debate. You have to be informed, and you have to, in a sense, learn the skills of civil debate and deep listening. So I think that there are ways through the work that we do, whether they're celebratory in the form of a festival or critical in the form of whether it's an exhibition or a social action, or they're commemorative, like what Pat Turner is doing, Kay Turner is doing with her memorial, COVID memorial project, that there really are ways. And I think that academic folklorists, to the degree that they really are people who are only in the academy or only in the public sector, I think that academic folklorists are able to, in a sense, think about, write about, and provide a kind of intellectual insight into what's actually going on. So in that regard, I do think that we are in an historic and transformative moment. And I do think that as folklorists that we have the sensitivity, the tools, and the experience to actually make a difference.
Well, so Barbara, do you think, so one of the things, several things that you've said here, one, and then we've got to move to these questions and things that are coming up in the chat. But so there's a shift here that has to do with our shared, first of all, if our shared object of inquiry is the same thing, then that should then we should be able to deal across the divides that we have. If that shared object of inquiry is, say, communities or something like that. But the backdrop, if it's civil society, that wasn't the backdrop we were working with in the 1970s. So this is new and it's big, and we have a lot of work ahead of us.
You know, it's actually very interesting that you put it that way, because I think that in the 60s, one of the big ideas was the new ethnicity. And the new ethnicity was essentially white. The new ethnicity was immigrant groups, ethnic groups. And so that was like all those dissertations at Indiana on the folklore of Ukrainians in America, the folklore of Swedes. I mean, it was Barbara Klein and Robert Klimash, my work on, Jews in Toronto. It was the new ethnicity that created, I would say, a sense of these enclaves, of these immigrant groups, and an interest in, to what degree they were really relic areas, to what degree did they bring folklore from the old country, did they retain it, did they get rid of it, did they create new forms, etc. And there were just one dissertation after the other for Romanians and for just, all different groups. That then really, I would say, changed, and the focus really became rather around Native Americans, African Americans, Latino Americans, Asian Americans. It really sort of shifted away from those sort of ethnic immigrant groups, particularly those, I would say, who arrived. Well, some of them arrived in the late 19th century, but a lot of them arrived in the 20th century. And then I would say that since then, or maybe even at the same time, we've been very, I would say our work has been very connected to communities, however we define them, whether we define them locally as within a particular region or city or neighborhood, whether we think of them translocally, I don't know, but I think community in a very broad and flexible sense, but not civil society. And I think that what has been interesting for me at POLIN Museum is that civil society is a more useful way of thinking about our public than community. We think in terms of community also, the local neighborhood, because we're sitting in a residential neighborhood. If you will, the city of Warsaw, the Polish public, the international visitors, the Jewish public, people from Israel, people, from the Jewish diaspora, those who don't fit into any of those categories. But when we think really about what transcends or what connects all of them, it is civil society. And it is something that transcends local attachment. And that, I think, that's not the way folklorists generally think. But I do think, and it comes not from my work that I did at NYU in performance studies, it comes from the work I've been doing in a museum.
Okay, Barbara, thank you. We've got about almost a little more than half an hour left. I'd like to, Amy, do you have another question that you'd like to ask before we open it up?
I just want to observe that it's so interesting that those ethnic studies dissertations didn't interrogate the fact that whiteness was just emerging for those populations. They weren't yet. They weren't really
yet white. Jews, Irish, Italians, they
Okay.
weren't white.
Right. Right. And it was interesting that the dissertations were doing this kind of affirmation of the kind you're talking about of local competencies. And it wasn't yet in the discourse to say these are people who aren't yet white. Those dissertations have happened more recently, I have to say, that people going back to those ethnic groups have looked at that, right, in the last 10 years or so, or more. So I think, yes, let's turn to the questions. I mean, one of the things a lot of people have been asking about more about your work in the museum, but I think you have been telling us something about that, but perhaps there's more that you want to add about your experience working in the museum in Warsaw, or generally working in an ethnographic museum context.
Sure. Well, I would say, okay, so the Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw was conceived from the outset. It was understood from the outset that it would be a multimedia narrative exhibition, that the main exhibition, the core exhibition, what some museums would call their permanent exhibition, would be a multimedia narrative exhibition. And that was of necessity because the museum was created on the rubble of the Warsaw Ghetto in the pre-war Jewish neighborhood, which means that it didn't start with an historic building or an historic neighborhood, and it didn't start from a collection. And even if it had had a collection, the material that it could have possibly used, whether it was its own collection or other collections anywhere in the world, private or public, would have been largely 19th and 20th century material. And the museum was committed to telling a story of 1,000 years. So it was clear that to do so in a compelling way, we really needed to take a different approach. So it was a curse and a blessing in the sense that the curse was that we didn't have a lot of wonderful original objects, which many Polish visitors expect and want to see. And it was a blessing because we had a free slate, we had a free hand. We could do whatever we wanted. And of course we do show original objects, but it doesn't, and the blessing also is that we weren't stuck with a collection and forced to tell the story through what we had. So that's my starting point. Now, the single most valuable object we had, which as a folklorist and as a given the nature of my own work, was really a wonderful starting point, is that the single most valuable object we had was the story. And the idea that this was a narrative museum, I was completely at home. Narrative, hey, do folklorists understand narrative? I mean, of course they understand narrative. They understand storytelling. And this was a beautiful case of there's a big macro narrative, but it is expressed through micro narratives and through storytelling. And it isn't just a matter of, storytelling in some banal sense of the word. It is really about narration and about what I call mode of narration. And I felt that if I were, quite apart from the fact, that I'm a child of Polish Jews, that my field is East European Jewish, Polish Jewish, Yiddish culture, that I've loved museums since childhood. All of that's great. But the other, in a sense, unexpected gift is that as a folklorist, I brought my interest theoretically and empirically in storytelling, and that this was going to be a storytelling museum. So what did that mean? It meant that, and also performance studies. It meant that, and we worked with a wonderful design team, a design team in London called Event Communication, and with one particular designer that was my personal favorite, Arnaud Deschel. And he had done his master's in, I think, something, well, I wouldn't call it theater design, but working with the concept of narrative space. And I thought, wow, narrative space, what an interesting idea. So put together Arnaud's narrative space, my interest and work in storytelling, and performance studies, and we produced what I like to think of as a theater of history. So it was such a perfect coming together of these areas and a way of really leveraging my own theoretical and empirical work on narrative, narrative, in every regard. So that was really super important. The second is I was very fortunate that the historians that were the scholars, and not just historians. We had historian, art historian, social psychologist, literary person, like a regular historian. I think I mentioned religious studies myself. It was a sociologist. So we had a very interdisciplinary team of academics, and they were very oriented towards social history. Well, social history means ordinary people, everyday life. Hey, I'm completely at home with that. So the idea that ordinary people are agents of history, and that also that collective action, which is also a part of my civil society argument of the power of collective action, particularly organized at the grassroots, these were ideas that really shaped the historical narrative and the way in which we presented this history. And I felt that I was very well prepared, as a folklorist, I was very, very well prepared for that as well. And then the third would be that the idea that, and this was very important, not only did we not have a lot of original objects, and we're not going to be able to, in a sense, tell the story through these objects, which even if we had them, we wouldn't have been able to, given the story that we wanted to tell. It turned out that one of our greatest assets was, in fact, intangible heritage. And it was very helpful to be able to think in terms of that category, which is not a category that the historians and that the other scholars were bringing to this project. They brought, huge amount of the project, but thinking theoretically about narration, our literary scholar did for sure, but thinking historically about mode of narration, thinking theoretically, intellectually about the idea of intangible heritage, which is another way of thinking about our textual sources, which were extremely important in finding the narratives from which we would build the big story. These are all, I would say, assets that I brought as a folklorist to the project.
So Barbara, would you say that this idea, which Mary and I really were taken with in all of our conversations with you, this idea of the intangible heritage of embodied knowledge, so the intangible heritage of embodied knowledge, is that something particular to folklore, or that folklore is particularly good at thinking about?
I think it is. I think that one of my inspirations is the work of Diana Taylor in our department, who's a very dear friend and colleague. And she has been written about the body as an archive. And so that was very, very important to her work. And in performance studies, the idea of embodied knowledge is extremely important. The idea that performers, particularly dance, in the case of dance, but not only in the case of dance, that really the body is an archive, and that dance has had a huge challenge in trying to write itself down, because its pedagogy has been to transmit the embodied knowledge literally from body to body. And so like labanotation and all of these various forms of notation of attempting to somehow or other render that embodied knowledge in a graphic or textual form has been a theoretically extremely interesting place to try to understand the nature of embodied knowledge and what is only transmittable through that kind of in-person embodied, literally embodied transmission. Well, I think, as we've talked about before, and as I've also discussed, that really came to great clarity when we were working on creating the wooden ceiling and roof based on the synagogue that once stood in the wooden synagogue that once stood in Gvozdets, which is today in Ukraine. And this is one of the great wooden synagogues among hundreds of them that had been created in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries in the territory that is now Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Belarus, and the surrounding area. They were magnificent structures, and all of them were destroyed. Whatever was left was destroyed by the Germans during the war. And so it was very important for us in our 18th century gallery to somehow or other represent this pinnacle of vernacular architecture. But even if any of them had existed, we weren't going to physically move a wooden synagogue into the gallery. But the solution that we came up with was inspired by, we worked with a educational company that is a nonprofit educational studio in Massachusetts called Hans House Studio. And their mission is to recover lost objects. And what they say is that you can never recover the object, in the original object, in terms of the original material. But what you can recover is the knowledge of how to build it. In other words, the intangible heritage, by building it using traditional materials, tools, and techniques. And that embodied knowledge, the recovery of that knowledge, is the value of what we created. And what I love is this sort of paradox that in order to recover the knowledge, you actually have to materialize it. And that the embodiment of the knowledge is there in your relationship, the relationship of your body to the tools, to the materials, to the techniques. And so this is really inspired. I don't know that they necessarily thought of it this way when they began, but since then, I think they have thought about it. And that is that the Japanese wooden shrines that say of themselves that they're 800 years old and never more than 20 years old, because they destroy it every 20 years in order to have to rebuild it, because it's only in rebuilding it that they can transmit the knowledge of how to rebuild it to future generations of craftsmen. So for them, the original material of the wooden object isn't it's not where the value lies. I mean, that's why I think that, admitting to the World Heritage sites, architectural sites that are not made of stone, but are made of perishable, ephemeral materials, really began to recognize that the original material isn't the be all and end all, that there are other aspects that require different thinking and different approaches, and they are the intangible aspects. So that for me was just, I mean, I could think about that to the ends of the earth in terms of trying to understand this relationship. And I like to say is that, tangible objects are meaningless without what we call intangible heritage. That they become, without the intangible heritage that makes them meaningful, they become matter that does not matter. And so that idea that museums are not just repositories of material culture, but that they are repositories of the tangible and intangible heritage, and that these are not separate, but that without if we're lucky, we've got the tangible heritage, but it's only meaningful in relation. In other words, otherwise they're just orphan objects. And for example, POLIN Museum's approach to collecting is to collect objects with stories, to collect them with their intangible aspects. That is critically important. But the idea of embodiment, that is such a rich way and such an interesting way to think. And of course, this Livelihoods project was perfect for the purpose.
I'm going to switch gears here because Kate Turner has a question, and the rest of you could pose questions as well. She says, I'm in complete agreement with Barbara. This is about civil society. She says, civil society addresses protocols, rituals, traditions, customs for inviting strangers, for knowing each other across boundaries. A shift to civil society as a focus also sharpens the responsibilities associated with community as an, all caps, act, not as a group, all caps. Please comment on this.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, Kay, I really want to thank you and congratulate you on the memorial project, which I think is amazing. And I do think that the protests that we've seen over the last few months are examples of collective action that are collective actions of civil society that cross-cut and really cut across what we think of as communities. And I think they are really exemplary, and they really show us the power of broad collective action. I mean, we're seeing it elsewhere too. I mean, where you can see it perhaps most dramatically in recent memory is at the European Solidarity Center in Gdańsk, which documents the peaceful, basically the power of collective action of civil society in bringing about peaceful revolution. And that brought about the fall of communism, which, that is huge. That is really massive. And so I'm with you completely on, and I think you formulated it really beautifully.
Barbara, Chris Muley, is it Muley or Mule? Asks, are there differences between strengthening civil society and the push for cultural democracy of years ago? Are you seeing differences?
Oh, no, I think that this, for me, they're completely linked. That is to say that when I think of civil society as a sense of collective responsibility that goes beyond local community, this is extremely important because in an era of polarization, you can have very strong community, but you can also get strong polarization and intensification of, if you believe in conflict. And I think what that civil society offers, in other words, it's not either or. Of course, we want strong local communities, strong neighborhoods, and a lot of organizing and living and collective action at the local level. But the ability to transcend the local and to come together in a much broader coalition and much broader collectivity, which I would think of as civil society, is absolutely critical. Now, cultural democracy, I think, is absolutely critically important because when I say civil society, I don't mean a neutralization of all of the kind of cultural capital that is coming from all of the constituents that is forming the civil society. On the contrary, I think that we can be leveraging, if you will, the cultural and social capital that all of these constituencies are bringing to this much broader collectivity. So I see these as really mutually reinforcing.
Barbara, I want to thank you for something.
By all means.
In 1997, I went into your office at NYU Performance Studies. I had recently finished a master's degree at the Gallatin School of NYU. I had taken some courses in performance studies. And I said, Professor, I think I want to do a PhD. I'm interested in storytelling. And you know what you said to me? You said, Eric, you've seen what we do here. Why don't you go to Penn and study folklore? And
Did
I
you?
did it. I did it. And I'm
great.
so grateful to you because before then I hadn't thought of folklore as an academic discipline, but I did, and I went, and it's really changed my life, and I owe it to you.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. Thank you, Eric.
I want to
Thank you.
remind everyone that we'd love to have you post your stories to the chat. And now I see that you can unmute yourselves. Charles, do you want to ask your question in your own voice?
Oh, all right. So first of all, hi, Barbara. Hi, everyone. Good to
Charles.
see you. Wonderful, wonderful discussion. You haven't just moved between a number of different fields and disciplines, but you've actually shaped them. So I think you have a really interesting way of seeing, at the same time that you continue to identify and build the field of folklore, folkloristics, but to be able to see that in some sort of broader comparative perspective. Where is it in your view now? What is this moment? Is this a moment of creativity, of unthinking that's pushing off into new directions or not? And where do you think, what steps during this most uncertain time should it be taking?
Oh, that's a big question. Well, first of all, Charles, I want to thank you very much for hosting me at UC Berkeley. Just before the pandemic and the lockdown hit, we were very, very fortunate to be able to get there under the wire, and it was a very great pleasure. And I did so enjoy meeting your students, outstanding, and also learning more, about your very, very important work. Particularly, on the medical side of things. So I thank you very much for that. It's a very big question. I don't know that I'm very well positioned to answer it because I haven't been in the I haven't been dealing with folklore in the academic world for some time. So it's really a question that I would want to put out to those who are with us today. Because, I mean, the question, to put it this way, the questions I would ask in order to be able to come to some kind of an answer is, first of all, what is the state of folklore within the academy? And that is to say, I have the feeling that, well, I'm not sure. I just don't know. To what extent is it a freestanding field? And when I'm thinking North America. so Canada as well. So of course, Newfoundland, but as well, Berkeley, Indiana, Penn, Texas, Ohio. I think in a way, I would depend on you to tell me, are you getting support? Are you getting students? Are you being absorbed into other departments and programs? Are you on the edge of being dissolved? I mean, are you the last man standing in the case of Penn? In other words, where are we in the academy in terms of our institutional safety net, in our institutional security? I mean, just simply at that very, very survival, in other words, our existential condition within the academy. Then, of course, intellectually, we can do whatever we want no matter where we are. We don't have to be in a folklore department or a folklore program. Intellectually, we can be wherever we want. And I don't know within AFS, for example, what that looks like. I don't know in what intellectual milieu, in what intellectual environment, people who self-identify as folklorists or who think of contributing to a field that they think of as folklore, I don't know intellectually where they are working and how their work is being shaped by that intellectual milieu. And then the thirdly, so it's very hard for me to, it's very, very hard for me to answer because I don't feel well positioned to make an assessment of where we are. I mean, it would mean, say, for example, looking at the books that are being reviewed by JFR, or look at what's being published in the Journal of American Folklore, or what the, who are being given, or what books are being given the Chicago Folklore Prize. I mean, I'm not sure like where to look to establish a kind of a baseline for where we are right now. That I really would depend on you to indicate that, because I think that has to be our starting point for thinking about whether we're already forward or whether we really need to say, wow, is that where we are? Shouldn't we be thinking a lot more forward? Should we be thinking more in terms of, if you will, not so much quote applied folklore, but folklore, what folklorists can offer to critical issues. So for example, what I think is really interesting is the attempt, let me do it this way. The attempt by ICOM, the International Council on Museums, UNESCO's International Council on Museums, to write a new definition of folklore, of museum. And I wonder if that exercise might not have implications for a new definition of, let's say, folkloristics or folklore as a field, however you want to put it. What's the difference between the old definition and the new definition? The old definition is very kind of sweet and descriptive. It's to preserve and present the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and, for the betterment of society, something along those lines. The new definition is activist. The new definition is about the role of museums and taking up issues of relevance to contemporary society. That's a new definition. So it's not about, all of our wonderful treasures and our wonderful heritage and civilization and art and et cetera. And of course, Louvre wasn't thrilled about this, and a number of other museums wouldn't go along with it. And this new definition was not accepted. But what it did say is that we have an obligation as museums to address issues of gender, race, climate, human rights. It went down the whole panoply of lists. Now, it doesn't mean that we turn museums into, political activists, organizations to the exclusion of all else. But it did really, I would say, ask museums to think about their relevance to issues of relevance to contemporary society. And I actually think folklorists do that to some degree. I mean, certainly, Charles, your work is absolutely exemplary in that regard. I think Kay's project in the public sector is absolutely exemplary. I think Mary's work on environmentalism, I think Amy's work, for example, on empathy, I think of, I can think of umpteen different examples where folklorists have brought a really rich perspective to those issues in our particular way. Now, whether or not that defines the field and its future direction, or whether that represents the work of a section or a part of the society or of the field or of random individuals, I'm not prepared to say. But I wonder if we're not at a moment that might be comparable to this moment that museums are facing in redefining what they are and what they should be. I mean, that would be my best response.
Thank you, Barbara. Galit Hazan Rokem had a sort of follow-up question.
And
I'll let you ask it.
Tim Lloyd has a question, which has been pending for a long time.
Oh, sorry, we'll let Tim Lloyd go first and then Galit.
Galit's maybe more anyway, maybe Galit should go and then we invite Tim. Just go ahead and unmute your mics and ask your questions.
Galit, you're first.
Thank you, everybody, for this wonderful occasion of, thank you, Barbara, of course.
Hi, Galit. It's great to see you.
Hi, far away. So there is a price to pay for maintaining folklore programs in time, in intellectual, the way you use your time when you have a program. There's less intellectual freedom than in being anywhere in any department and doing folklore. But the question is, how do you educate the next generation of folklorists outside an institutional framework and give them the courses they need and so on? Eric told the story about being sent to Penn because you said, there's no folklore here, right? But I think you did educate some folklorists in the performance studies department. So I want you to tell us how to bridge that dilemma.
Well, I think if speaking only from my own experience in performance studies, I would say that I didn't teach what you would call folklore courses in the way that I was trained. I didn't teach them, I didn't offer a course on the folktale, the English and Scottish popular ballad. Yeah, I didn't teach those kind of classic courses in the way that Dundas envisioned the field, that Dorson envisioned the field. But I would say that I did put it this way. What I did do was to orient them to being able to bring a variety of tools interdisciplinarily to the study of everyday life. Whether it's ritual, procession, parades, graffiti, storytelling, food, whatever it might be, it was somewhere between folklore and ethnography. That's not even a very interesting distinction to make, because I think that folklorists work ethnographically, but that their focus is sometimes a little bit different and their methods might be different. And some of the questions they would ask and what they would find interesting would be different. So the first thing would be that it was through teaching, even if I wasn't teaching classic folklore courses. So it would be through teaching. But then what it really was through working with individual students on specific projects, whether it was a project specifically for the course or it was a dissertation. So for example, or a master's thesis. So for example, with say Joe Scherer, it was on the polio, not the polio, but the Giglio, a wonderful, wonderful traditional procession in Williamsburg in Brooklyn, or with Eve Jochnowitz on Jewish foodways, or there like a whole series of dissertations, master's theses, and projects for particular courses that were classic projects that you could easily imagine that could happen within a folklore program, a folklore course, but that were easily accommodated and that I was equipped to really direct and shape even within a performance studies, so-called performance studies course or performance studies program. So that would be how I myself would how I would respond to that, which is really different from, let's say, at IU, where you could actually offer a kind of a top to bottom coherent set of courses from which students could choose, or for that matter, say at Berkeley under Charles or in Ohio, where the constellation of courses and the people you could work with, because although there were other faculty, I mean, for example, Deborah Kapchin is on the performance studies faculty. She's a folklorist. And studying with her, whatever you want to call it, equips you as well, whether or not the course is called folklore. It doesn't matter what it's called.
But
And
it seems useful that there be at least a couple of departments somewhere
I agree.
in the space, right?
I'll tell you something. I actually, for me, I have a very strong feeling and attachment to the history of the field. I have to say, and I think it's because I had such a positive experience of discovering this field for myself and discovering it in its, I would say, historical and classic form. So, I still have the motif index on my shelf, all the volumes of it. I still have, the tail type index, and I have, from FFC, the various monographs, and I have, the Legends of the Jews and Dove Noise motif index, and, I have all, and I feel very attached to that history. I wouldn't call it nostalgia. I don't want to call it nostalgia. I don't want to call it sentimental value, but it is, I still, a piece of me is very connected to the deep history of the field, its intellectual history, its institutional history. And also, I think maybe it's also because I have a very deep feeling of connection to the history of the study of Jewish folklore specifically. And what's fascinating for me is there's a whole new generation of people who are engaging with this material who are not in folklore programs. They might be klezmer musicians. They might be interested in the Yiddish folk song. They might be coming from somewhere else, but they are engaging with this historical material. So, but yes, I think you're right. I think it is important. And I just hope that 10 years, 15 years from now, we'll still be looking at places that have folklore programs. I do hope so. I mean, what are our chances? You got to tell us. Galit, Charles, Mary, Amy, how are we looking? Are we going to be here? I mean, are we going to be here as standing in 15 years?
In some way, shape, or form, I'm sure we will. Barbara, we are just about at the end here. Tim Lloyd posted a question, which could be a good last question. It has to do with your recent move. I'd like to invite, speaking of all those books that you've just recently had to relocate to your new place. Tim Lloyd has a question for you about that.
He's unable to unmute himself.
Oh, he's not?
I think I'm working now.
Oh, great.
Oh.
Go ahead, Tim.
Okay.
Hi,
so
Barbara.
Tim,
Hi, everyone.
Oh,
Just a quick,
hi, Tim.
just a quick question. I know that you and Max have recently moved from the place where you've lived on the Bowery for as long as I can remember to a new home. And moves to a new home, especially from a place where one has lived for a long time, can often be the occasions for some kind of personal or professional life review. I wonder if that happened for you, and if so, what you learned from it.
Well, okay. So first of all, it was traumatic. It was also a blessing in disguise. I think that it all worked out very well, but at the time it was absolutely traumatic. We lived in our earlier place for 44 years, and you can imagine the accumulation of 44 years, especially if you are a collector verging on being a pack rat and almost a hoarder. So it's, there's a kind of a slippery slope there, and it was maybe good that at the 44-year mark, something happened and we had to do something. So bottom line was this. My personal library, I don't know how many books it is now, 13,000, 14,000, something along those lines. So it's a lot of books. And I also had been in Poland full time, for many years. And as a result, I had not had the opportunity to really take care of, all of my stuff, and it accumulated and there were heaps and piles. I should have prepared some slides of our purge, because I think if you saw it and saw the magnitude of it, you'd really appreciate what was involved. So I would say, in answer to your question, that well, two things. One, there was really I wouldn't call it a purge. It was eliminating of a lot of stuff that should have been eliminated a long time ago. A lot of, I mean, all kinds of drafts of dissertations and of, you know, grant applications and things that have been just piles and piles and piles. I eventually tied them all up in bundles for recycling, and I heaped them up and took a photograph because I couldn't believe at the mountain of them that how did it take so long to get rid of this stuff? So that was at one level, was just getting rid of garbage. I mean, it was painless. On the contrary, it was like a relief to be able to get rid of the garbage. The second had to do with a discovery of what I actually had, which was like miraculous. When I realized the treasures, of course, as my husband it's like anathema for him to hear this. But anyway, when I realized the treasures that I had that I didn't even realize or that I had forgotten, and I couldn't remember even how I got them, well, that was completely astonishing. So it was, I wouldn't say it was a review. I would say that it was a very, very difficult, very challenging, I would say, more than a transition. It wasn't even a transition. It was a revolution. I would say that it was a revolution, and it wasn't so much a review, but gosh, I have to think about it.
Well, we've come
Thank
to the
you.
end of our time. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, everyone. We've got a lot of posts from the programs that want you to know that they're doing well at Goucher, at WKU, also at Ohio State. We're, until now, we have vitality. So lots of fabulous students, that I'll say, and many of them are here. But it's now time to conclude this session, which could go on and on. What a blessing you are, Barbara. We are so grateful to you for being such a mentor to so many of us. I'm speaking not just for Mary and me, but for many, many, many people who are here. So we look forward to seeing you more now at AFS, whether virtually or in person. And we're so glad to have you back. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I want to thank both of you. I want to thank the fellows, and I want to thank all of you who have been with us for this hour and a half. I very, very much look forward to reading the comments. I'm glad that we're going to be saving the chat. I'm saving it this very moment, just in case, because I don't want to take a chance that, that I might somehow rather lose it. But it really is a pleasure. And going forward, let's see what the impact of our Zoom conference will be on our future conferences. We were talking about that earlier, but I really do appreciate this opportunity, and I thank you very, very much.
Bye, everyone.